So the purpose of dietary guidelines are pretty well summarized in the foreword of the respective documents from different countries. So this is one that is from the Australian version of the dietary guidelines in 1992, which states that the dietary guidelines for Australians provide advice to the general population about the choice of foods to eat so that their usual diet contributes to a healthy lifestyle and is consistent with minimal risk for the development of diet-related diseases. They summarize current nutrition knowledge and act as triggers to other more comprehensive education programs to achieve their aims. And more recently, in the American version of the dietary guideline, this is what is in the foreword to explain the purpose of the dietary guidelines. So the dietary guidelines is designed for professionals to help all individuals, okay, everyone in the society ages 2 years and older, and the families consume a healthy, nutritionally adequate diet. The information in the dietary guidelines is used in developing federal food, nutrition, and health policies and programs. It also is the basis of federal nutrition education materials designed for the public and for the nutrition education components of different programs run by the government agencies. It is developed for use by policymakers and nutrition and health professionals. Additional audiences who may use dietary guidelines information to develop programs, policies, and communication for the general public include businesses, schools, community groups, media, and the food industry, as well as state and local governments. So you can see that there was a shift from the target audience, in the target audience from the general population to actually professionals and policymakers. And that has something to do with the way that these dietary guidelines are worded. So when you read the dietary guideline documents, you can see that the statements or the guidelines are very general without specific numbers or targets to aim for. That would mean it would be very, very difficult for the general population to understand how to apply these dietary guidelines in terms of how it translates to what types of foods, how much of each kind of foods that they should be eating. Okay, so when we look at dietary guidelines, the most comprehensive version that you can find in any country is the one from America. And the latest version is the one that is published in the year 2000. So from 2000 to 2025. So DGA 2020 to 2025, which is developed by the Department of Agriculture in the state and also the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a very, very comprehensive document. If you want to have a look, the link is provided at the bottom of this page. It's a few hundred pages altogether if you read the overall scientific evidence document. There is also a summary document that is much shorter for easy comprehension by most health professionals. So these are the 4 basic US dietary guidelines for the year 2020 to 2025. So if you read the actual statements on the dietary guidelines, they are very, very vague. Okay, so it doesn't give you specifics. So for example, if you look at the first one, follow a healthy dietary pattern at every life stage. What does that actually mean to you without digging into the details? So if you as a student in food and nutritional science major don't have a clue about what this means, then what do you think the general public would understand this statement as? Everyone can interpret it slightly differently or even completely differently. So that's why in the foreword of the dietary guidelines, it now states that the dietary guidelines are developed for use by health professionals as well as policymakers, not by the general public. There's another set of dietary standards that you can utilize amongst the general public. So the second one, customize and enjoy nutrient-dense food and beverage choices to reflect personal preferences, cultural tradition, and budgetary considerations. Focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages and stay within calorie limits. and limit foods and beverages high in added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, and limit alcoholic beverages. So all these statements are pretty vague without giving you a quantitative target to aim for. If you dig into the specific description of each of the dietary guidelines, it still doesn't give you very much information about the quantities of food that you should be consuming. For example, number 1, follow a healthy dietary pattern at every life stage. So it states that at every life stage, infancy, toddlerhood, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, pregnancy, lactation, and older adulthood, it's never too early or too late to eat healthfully. So for about the first 6 months of life, exclusive breastfeeding should be the primary choice, and continue to feed infants human milk through at least the first year of life and longer if desired. Okay, and use iron-fortified infant formula if human milk is available. So very, very general advice without digging into the specific quantities. So how much human milk should the baby be consuming is not reflected in the dietary guidelines. So, and then at about 6 months, introduce nutrient-dense complementary foods. Okay, so again, very general advice. And from 12 months through older adulthood, follow a healthy dietary pattern across the lifespan to meet nutrient needs. Okay, what does that mean? What are the nutrient needs? Okay, without digging into other documents, there's nowhere to be found. It's nowhere to be found in the dietary guideline documents. Okay. So therefore, now you should have a better understanding why the dietary guidelines should not be used by the general public themselves alone. It should be used by health professionals or policymakers to guide the interventions, the strategies to improve the overall diet of the population. So I'm not going to read through each of the description. You can have a read at home. Now, the third dietary guideline talks about food groups. So the food groups relates to the My Plate dietary guides, My Plate, or which is equivalent to the healthy eating pyramid in Hong Kong. The state decided that the pyramid doesn't really reflect how people eat, so they changed it to the plate shape. But the concept is the same. It shows the proportion of the different food groups within the diet that you should be aiming for. So in the My Plate guide, you will see vegetables, fruits, grains, dairy, and protein and oils. 6 types. Okay, very similar to what you will find in the healthy eating pyramid. Okay, and there are some general recommendations about what types of these different food groups or food in these different food groups that you should be aiming for. Say, for example, for proteins, you should be aiming for lean meat rather than fatty meat, things like that. And the reason behind these recommendations comes from caloric control. So you see that if you go for lean meat over higher fat meat, okay, then you can save around 87 calories out of 209. Okay. So all these different comparisons could be found in the actual dietary guideline document, a very thick report. So it shows graphically how much energy or calories you could be saving by switching to a lower fat version of the same type of food. So for example, go from whole fat milk to fat-free milk, you can save around 40% of calories. Okay, there will be a lot of these examples that you can find. More importantly, going from nutrient dense to the non-nutrient dense typical version of the food, this shows you what the equivalents could be. For example, if you eat breakfast cereals, you can find something called frosted shredded wheat, which is a typical version of breakfast cereals that is not considered nutrient dense per calorie, okay? Because it's very high in sugar, so per calorie, the nutrient density is not high. So by switching to a plain shredded wheat without all the sugar, the nutrient density will go up because the calorie is much lower. Same goes for yogurts. If you go for full fat yogurt with added sugar, then you have lots of calorie with little nutrients. Whereas if you go for the plain low fat yogurt, You can take out all the excess calorie with similar amount of nutrient. Therefore, the nutrient density goes up. Okay, so a lot of these different visual examples are given in the report. And the last one, last dietary guideline states that limit foods and beverages high in added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, and limit alcoholic beverages. So this one gives some specific numbers of targets that you should aim for. For added sugar, you should aim for less than 10% of calories per day. Saturated fat, again, less than 10% of calories. Sodium, less than 2,300 milligrams. And then alcoholic beverages, if they haven't started drinking, don't start. If they are drinking already, then limit to no more than 2 standard drinks per day in men, and less than 1 per day in women. Okay, so this is the only dietary guideline in the USDG that gives you some specific quantities as targets to aim for. All right, but otherwise, when you look at the whole dietary guideline documents, which is a few hundred pages thick, there are only 4 very general statements given as the guidelines. Okay, so it's very open to different interpretation. So it's your job as the nutrition professional to help the general public to interpret these guidelines correctly. And what else you can do with the dietary guideline includes research. You can then formulate research question that assesses how well the population is performing according to the dietary guidelines. Okay, so in this figure, it shows you the adherence to of the U.S. population to the dietary guidelines across life stages, as measured by average total healthy eating index, which is a way to assess whether the specific quantitative targets as decided by experts have been met. Okay, so it gives you can consider that as a score from 0 to 100. So if you get a score of 100, that means you are adhering to the dietary guidelines perfectly. If you get a score of 0, that means your diet does not conform to the dietary guidelines at all. So you see that the most problematic age group is adolescents, okay? Late childhood and early adolescence. Okay, so they only meet about half of the dietary guideline by the scale, and the older adults tend to do a bit better. Toddlers also tend to do better, but none of these groups have a close to perfect diet that is as assessed by the dietary guidelines. Okay, so a lot needs to be done. And if you look at the specific recommendations, okay, all right, so those who are below, at or above each of the dietary goals, only a small proportion of the population have been able to meet the vegetable target, okay? And especially red and orange vegetables. The most successful, so to speak, dietary target that the U.S. population ages 1 and older is able to meet is refined grains. Okay? Most are eating enough or above the goal. Okay, but for all the other healthy ones like vegetables, fruits, total grains, dairy, and total protein, a substantial proportion of the population are eating below the targets. That means a lot needs to be done to improve the consumption of these very healthy food groups. And it was actually reflected very badly on the healthy eating index, as I've shown you. That's why they're considered only meeting half of the dietary guidelines. So the 85-15 guide is used to inform the recommended diet. So the percentage calorie needed to meet food group needs with nutrient-dense choices and percentage left for other uses. So when we design dietary guidelines, we determine the amount of calories of foods that we should be consuming, we won't be so cruel to take away all your enjoyments. Okay? That's why we are only using about 85% of your daily energy quota, so to speak, for inclusion of the essential or nutrient-dense items that would cover all your nutrient needs. We will spare about 15% of the calorie for your discretionary choices. Okay, so you can use it for whatever types of food you want. If you like to drink your milk, you can drink an additional cup or two of milk without any consequences on your overall health. Or if you like to eat your junk food, you can have 15% of your calories per your daily quota to do that. So for example, if your daily requirement is 2000 calories, okay, we'll only use 1700 calories to cover this part. That would leave you 300 calories to eat your junks. So you can eat Tim Tams, you can eat Big Mac, half a Big Mac, not a full Big Mac, for the 300 calories without affecting your overall health by too much. Okay, so that's the way the recommended diet is designed. So when we look at the top sources of the bad nutrients or negative nutrients, added sugar, saturated fat, sodium, this is what it looks like in the American population. And in Hong Kong, it should be roughly the same, if not exactly the same, because overall in the world, around the world, especially in the developed countries, the dietary sources of these negative nutrients tend to be quite similar. So added sugar comes mostly from sugar-sweetened beverages, Coca-Cola, Sprite, etc., and then from snacks, desserts, and sweet snacks. Interestingly, quite substantial amount comes from coffee and tea, and that has quite a lot to do with Starbucks. Okay, when you order their coffee, quite some variety of their coffee choices have sugar added, right? And also the ready-to-drink coffees. Okay, we're not talking about the instant coffee that you make from the instant coffee powder, and the brewed coffee that you brew on your own. Okay, and then candies and sugars, breakfast cereals. So within sugar-sweetened beverages, of course, the top variety would be soft drinks. So there are other sugar-sweetened beverages like fruit drinks, which is only 25% juice by definition. The rest is sugar and water. And then sports and energy drinks. And within desserts and snacks, the primary source is cookie and brownies. Not so much in Hong Kong, I believe it will be other types of desserts. Okay, and then ice cream and frozen dairy desserts. So for saturated fat, the primary source is sandwiches. Okay, that has a lot to do with the fillings that they use and also the butter they put on their sandwiches. Okay. And sandwich forms a major part of the American diet as a major type of meal that they consume. So it would not be the same in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, it would be meat, okay, I believe, and also the takeaway foods. Okay. Desserts and sweet snacks, of course, you use butter to make cake, things like that. So you see saturated fat there and chocolates, right? Then sodium, again, it comes from sandwiches because of the types of fillings. So the processed meat fillings, of course, and also the bread contains sodium. So therefore, sandwiches is a top contributor to the sodium intake in the American population. In Hong Kong, it would be takeaways and sauces. Okay, we use a lot of sauces in our cooking. Okay, all right. So when you look at the percent of the population exceeding the limits of added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium on the bottom, close to 2/3 or more than 2/3 of the American population exceeded the intakes of added sugar, 10% of energy, and saturated fat, 10% of energy. And for sodium, the majority of them exceeded the limit of 2,300 milligrams. Okay? And that is already considering that the dietary assessment is not perfect. So the dietary assessment tends to underestimate the sodium intake. And even with this in mind, with the underestimation accounted for, there's still close to 90, more than 90%, close to all of the population are having excessive sodium intake. Right? When you look at the overall consumption of the healthier items, okay, this is from age 19 to age 30. Okay, so the average intake is substantially lower than the recommended intake ranges, okay, for most of the items except for grains, okay, and for protein in men. Okay, so therefore the healthy eating index is only around 56. If you look at older adults, okay, adult not older adults, 31 to 59 years of age. Then again, same problem with vegetables and fruits. Not so much problem with grains, but again, more problems with dairy. Same in men, they eat too much meat, too much protein. For sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, even though they eat slightly less sugar and slightly less saturated fat, but the problem is pretty much the same. Too much sugar, too much saturated fat, and too much sodium. So now we know the DRIs that we covered in the last lecture and the dietary guidelines. How do we plan our diet to meet these guidelines or reference standards? It might be easy or not so easy even for a nutritionist and dietitian, but for the general public, it is a virtually impossible task. Hence, we need simple layman guides for the general public. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So the DRI says the RDA of calcium equals around 1000 milligrams per day. So tell someone who is not studying FNS, your friend, your father or mother, your relatives, on this requirement. So you should aim for 1000 milligrams of calcium per day. Ask them to tell you how they plan to achieve it. I don't think the majority of them would have a clue of how this translates to food. Okay? Do I have to drink 3 liters of milk per day? Do I need to take lots of calcium supplement to achieve it? They wouldn't have a clear idea of how to achieve it. And this is just for one nutrient. Okay? And therefore, to assist the general public to make better food choices that fulfill the nutrient requirement, eat more easily. This is what the health professionals designed. So the My Plate or healthy eating pyramid in Hong Kong. So this gives the general public some visual idea of how they should be planning the proportion of the dietary intake. So the My Plate plan tells you that on your plate, okay, because in America they eat from a plate, unlike us, we eat from a bowl. So let's say we eat from a plate. Slightly more than a quarter of the plate should be filled with vegetables, and then slightly less than a quarter should be filled with fruits. Slightly more than a quarter for grains, and then slightly less than a quarter for protein, and then some dairy in between each meal. So this should be the proportion of each meal. So when you look at the typical American diet, on the other hand, let's go for a plate. What do you think the proportion would look like? That would be around this for grains, depending on what they're eating, and then this amount for protein, slight amount for veg, plus or minus fruit, sometimes no fruit. Okay, so it's completely out of proportion. Okay, and dairy is missing, sometimes no dairy. Okay, therefore, by giving the My Plate guide as a visual aid to inform the general public, they should have a better idea of how they should start to improve their overall dietary choices. So if you eat like this on a plate, when you see this dietary guideline on a My Plate format, your health professional would be able to tell you visually that you should cut down on your protein, close to halving them, slightly decrease your grain intake, increase your fruit and veg, okay, to about half of the plate, then include some dairy. So it's more visual and it's easier to understand than telling the person from the general population that you should aim for 1000 milligrams of calcium, 8 milligrams of iron, okay? All right, because those do not resonate well with the general population. Okay, so that's how the My Plate works. But in Hong Kong, we are still using the very antique healthy eating pyramid from the old days. So until there is a complete overhaul, we are stuck with this as our dietary guide for the Hong Kong population. But still, if you use it well, it will still be quite useful. So it tells us that in our overall diet, the majority should be made up of grains, and then vegetables and fruits, meat, fish, and eggs and alternatives should only form a small part of the diet. and then milk, include some milk and alternatives, and then use the least fat, oil, salt, and sugar. So if you look at the actual document, you'll find the recommended intake amounts for the different age groups. Okay, so for grains, the target is 3 to 8 bowls. That's a very wide range, and that's intended to cover the varying nutrient energy needs in different age groups. Vegetables, at least 3 servings. Fruits, at least 2 servings. Meat, fish, eggs, and alternatives, 5 to 8 taels, okay, which is a unique measurement unit in Hong Kong. 1 tael equals to 40 grams. Okay, so that translates to 200 to 320 grams. Okay, not a lot. Okay, that's all together in a day. So when you look at a piece of steak, it can easily be 250 grams per steak. So if you're eating 2 steaks meals per day, you're going over your limit of or recommended intake amount for meat, fish, eggs, and alternatives. And then for milk and alternatives, 1 to 2 servings. Fats, oil, salt, and sugar, each the least. And then fluids, 6 to 8 glasses. So notice the term he used here, fluid, not water. It counts all types of fluid, not just pure water. Okay, it could be soup, it could be coffee, it could be tea. So you don't have to drink 8 glasses of water per day, which is an urban myth. So what is the serving size of each of the food group? You'll be able to find it in the report as well, but I've listed them here. So a bowl of grain is about 1 bowl of cooked rice. Okay, usual size of bowl that you see in a Chinese restaurant that they use to hold the bowl of rice that you order, not the very big one that you might be using at home. So a typical size bowl. If it's a bowl of noodle, you can have 1 1/4 bowl. Bread would be 2 slices. Okay. Vegetables is about half a bowl cooked or 1 bowl raw, because when you cook vegetables, they shrink in size. Okay. A serving of fruit is equivalent to 1 medium-sized apple, 2 pieces of kiwi, or half a bowl of fruit cuts. Meat, one tael of meat, so 40 grams, is equivalent to 4 to 5 thin slices of cooked meat, 1 piece of egg, or 1 piece of silky tofu. Milk and alternative is a cup of milk or yogurt. If it is low-fat plain yogurt, you can have slightly less, 150 ml. Cheese would be 2 slices. So how are these amounts, serving sizes, determined? So each country has a slightly different way of doing it, but the principles are the same. So they would need to first create a diet that meets the RDA of key nutrients. For example, in Australia, they have created what they call dietary models to establish the amount of each food group required to meet the RDA of 10 key nutrients. And this is the process for the foundation and total diet development. Foundation diet is the diet that covers the RDA of the 10 selected nutrients in the case of Australia. So once you eat this foundation diet, all the RDAs of these 10 key nutrients would be met. Okay? And that, as I explained, would only take up around 80 to 85% of your overall calorie intake. That would leave you some spares for your discretionary choices. And when you add the discretionary choices, that would form your total diet. So that's the flow chart. But the more important part to look at is this part, modeling using what we call composite foods. So the foundation diet is developed excuse me, to provide overall numbers of serves of each of the major food groups using composite foods to cover the RDA for 10 key nutrients within the least energy required for age gender groups, within constraints for chronic diseases, social and environmental factors. And then you need to compare that with nutrient standards, usual intake, and remodel as necessary. Okay, so what you then do is to first develop foundation diets for each age and sex groups to meet the nutrient requirements for most people. That means you need to cover 100% of the RDAs. of the 10 key nutrients. And then based on the dietary patterns that meet the nutrient and energy requirements for the smallest and youngest least active individual in each age and gender group, because you don't want to use a diet that is excessive in calories. Okay, even within the same age and sex, there will be variations with the energy requirements. So to avoid introducing excessive calorie intake, when you design the foundation diet, you would need to make sure that you can achieve the RDA within the smallest amount of energy required. Okay, that fulfills the requirement for the smallest and youngest least active individual. And then you can make up of the energy deficits for the individuals in the age group requiring more energy by using the discretionary calories. Okay. So to model using food groups, you use a statistical technique called linear modeling, which you don't have to understand the technicality behind. Okay. But what it does is that it identifies diets with the least amount of energy, being able to meet the nutrient requirements and food group parameters. So there were limits that were set to instruct the statistical model around how to choose different food groups. For example, there would be an upper limit for the amount of meat that you can introduce in the diet. Okay, so as long as it is below, say, 3 servings per day, that would be considered okay. So with this limit, the model would then not select more than 3 servings of meat in the dietary model to create this foundation diet. Without this limit, you might see funny dietary patterns that ask you to consume, say, 10 servings of meat in order to meet your dietary requirement. That is complete nonsense in nutritional sense. Therefore, we would have to instruct the model about these limits. Okay, so upper limits. So the models were designed on a weekly basis. Okay, as you can recall, we mentioned that the RDA is designed as a target that is for the average daily intake. So technically, you do not have to consume all the nutrients above the RDA level every day. And to that end, we would then model the foundation diet on a weekly basis. As long as the average daily intake is above the RDA, we are happy. So then we will create the draft models, and then we review it. The professional experts review the models and then refine it after the comparison with RDAs. So the 10 nutrients included in the model would be energy plus these 10: protein, thiamine, vitamin A, vitamin C, folate, calcium, iodine, iron, zinc, and magnesium, because these are the nutrients that comes with an RDA, not an AI. Okay. Therefore, it's easier to ensure that if you, or not easier, you'll be more confident that when the intake is above the RDA, you will cover the requirements for most of the population. That means your foundation diet is nutritionally adequate. So I'm going to give you a small take-home exercise to complete. So I want you to try and estimate how many servings of each food group you are going to have today, and see whether you are following the healthy eating pyramid and how far off you are. Okay, so we're going to start a new topic series on program planning, okay, which is related to your assignment. So you have to pay good attention to it to be able to successfully complete your assignment. Otherwise, you have some issues or troubles trying to complete the assignment without understanding the content of these lecture series. So we start with needs assessment. So by the end of this lecture series, okay, you should be able to discuss the importance of incorporating the views of stakeholders in the food and nutrition system when planning interventions to improve the nutrition of populations, and then conduct a needs assessment for use in public health program planning. So we'll talk about why we need a needs assessment and also how to conduct a needs assessment. So the reason why you need to conduct a needs assessment is because you cannot efficiently solve a problem if you don't understand the problem. That means a needs assessment is a way for you to try and understand the problem. So on the screen, you will see the planning and evaluation cycle, and this graph would come up every now and then in the next few lectures, because we are going to complete, to talk about the complete planning and evaluation cycle to help you with your assignment. So needs assessment actually is the very beginning of the planning and evaluation cycle. All right, so we're going to focus on this part for this lecture series, and then we'll slowly move to the next few parts. Okay, it's actually defined very early on in the 1970s. So the word need in the public health context means a state, situation, or a condition in the community which by its presence or absence reduces, limits, or prevents normative action. Right? So it's quite complicated or quite abstract. So let's go for the word health need, which is more relevant to our practice. So health needs is defined as those states, conditions, and factors or factors in the community which, if absent, would prevent people from achieving optimal physical, mental, and social well-being. In other words, required actions, okay? Required conditions or required states to help people to become healthy. So that's the health need. What they need to become healthy, in simple terms, right? So needs assessment is something that allows you to identify the main nutrition or health problems in the community or in the population. It would help guide decisions regarding the planning of health interventions, which would also identify who to direct the messages to, what sort of messages to promote, and what programs need priority. In public health, prioritization is important because there is always only limited resources available in the public health setting, and you need to prioritize your spending of resources on programs that would need the most urgent attention. So why do we conduct a needs assessment? It will help you gather information about a population's needs or the actual population's problem to develop an intervention rather than assumption or your opinion. For example, if I ask you to now plan for a health promotion program for residents in the Sai Ying Pun region, okay? So without allowing you to go and conduct surveys or ask the residents, how can you plan a good program? Okay, you are mostly going to base the program on your assumption. You may be assuming that, oh, residents in the Sai Ying Pun region tends to be quite old, and there might be some issues with their calcium intake. Okay, so that's an assumption without the actual evidence behind. And as an example, okay, I would say as an example, maybe when you go and look up the actual calcium intake in the Sai Ying Pun region, there is no problem at all. Okay, people living in the Sai Ying Pun region may be very well educated about nutrition, and there's no calcium problem, intake problem in the Sai Ying Pun region. So if you run a health promotion program to improve the calcium intake in the Sai Ying Pun region, this is actually not addressing the actual needs of the population, because there is no problem with calcium intake at all as Sai Ying Pun. And you're wasting your resources, wasting your time, wasting your efforts. And therefore, it is very important to conduct needs assessment so that you understand the problem of your chosen target community, to allow you to design specific, targeted, and focused interventions, and also effectively plan, implement, and evaluate your intervention. Now, importantly, you should remember needs assessment not only identifies the problem, okay? It's not good enough to just identify the problem. Say you identify through surveys, through conducting interviews with the residents, through observing their dietary intake that they're eating too much meat. Now you have the evidence to confirm the actual issue in the Saying Point community. It's not good enough to stop there. If you want to run a successful nutrition intervention, public health nutrition intervention, you need to understand why this is happening. So you need to understand the determinants. Okay? Is it because the residents in the Saying Point region eats out a lot, or is it because they don't like to eat vegetables? What are the determinants of this very poor intake or excessive intake of meat? So you need to then make sure that your program addresses the needs. So make sure the needs are met. But there are different types of need, okay, in the population. So normative needs refers to the needs of a community determined by experts. So when you look at, say, Samshui, okay, where there's lots of South Asian migrants, the experts would tell you, experts from social work, from public health, would tell you that the normative needs of the Samshui community is low income. Okay? Low income is one of the biggest determinant to their health. Okay. And then felt needs, okay, which are the needs identified by the target group. So that would be the needs that you find out when you go and talk to people in the community. Okay? What they say that they want. Expressed needs are the needs identified by actions or demand on health services. For example, waiting list for dietitians, or whether you see a very long waiting list for the diabetes clinic in a particular region. Okay, if say in the Eastern District, the waiting list for diabetes clinic is 2 years, whereas in the Western District in Hong Kong, the waiting list is 5 years. Then something is not quite right, because the overall risk of diabetes determined by biology should be roughly the same within the population. So there shouldn't be such an excessive difference between the waiting list in the two regions in the same city. Okay. And then comparative needs is defined by comparison between similar groups when one community lacks services that are provided in another similar community. All right. So to perform needs assessment, you need to use information, or we call them intelligence. Okay. So the different types of intelligence includes what is the nature and characteristics of the communities or the populations. How are current services and initiatives responding to the health issue, both health and non-health related? Are there any gaps in services, and what environmental changes are required for health? So to perform a needs assessment, the first step is to identify the priority health problems. You can do it by using population survey, dietary data, or qualitative surveys or interviews within the community. It gives you an idea of the prevalence of the problem. So how big the proportion of the population in this community is affected. Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? And then also, who is most affected? And the different types of data you can get from surveys include mortality, which is related to death due to disease or nutrition issues. And then morbidity data, which includes data on incidence and prevalence of the disease or nutrition issues. So we'll cover the term incidence and prevalence more in the nutritional epidemiology lecture series, but in brief, incidence refers to new cases of the disease or nutrition issues, which is the current rate that the problem is being reported. Prevalence refers to existing cases of the diseases or the nutrition issue, which gives you the total burden of the disease. So to get these data, you can use different sources. So you can use national age and cost-specific mortality or morbidity data, which you can find on the Center for Health Protection website in Hong Kong. And you can then use it to describe the cost-specific trends over time and the variation in rates for at-risk groups. So for example, you'll be able to tell the trends of of colon cancer in Hong Kong using this kind of data. Okay, is it increasing? Is it dropping? Is it increasing in specific age and gender group, or is it not? Then you can also try and get dietary data from national nutrition surveys, which would give you information on the proportion of the population not meeting the requirements. Unfortunately, in Hong Kong, we do not really have this kind of data available. Okay, the closest thing that we have currently is the total dietary study from the first food consumption survey, which gives you a very, very rough estimation of the dietary intake of selected nutrients only, not all nutrients. Okay, so it's very difficult. Then if you can't find National Nutrition Survey, the next best thing to look for would be a representative dietary survey, as in a research study. Okay, you can find it from published papers. Okay, but you need to make sure that it is representative of the population that you're targeting. Okay, you can't use, for example, a survey done in older women to infer problems in younger men. All right. Then, of course, you can do interviews, especially with key informants, to understand the issues in the community. So in foreign countries, you can sometimes see community leaders. Okay. In Hong Kong, you can do so by going to the district councillors, for example, or even the chairperson of the actual building strata. Okay, the management committee of each of the building, which could tell you something about the community or church, okay, or the religious leaders within the community. So especially the ethnic minorities, they may have cultural or religion leader within the community. Then you can interview these people to try and understand the problems. Then the second step of needs assessment is to analyze the health problem. So what are the determinants, or in other words, what causes the problem? So if you don't know what causes the problem, then you can't effectively fix the problem. And then the impact of the problem, how serious is this? If it is not serious, then there's no urgent need to deal with it. The potential for intervention, can you make changes? Okay, can you improve the situation? If it is something that you can't change, then it would be futile effort to try and intervene on, because you can't really move or improve the issue. So pick an issue that you can make some improvements on. Then you need to review the literature to determine the best practice interventions. And then you need to identify who are the stakeholders and what else do you need to know. Like, do you need to perform formative research like interviews or focus groups to better understand the problem? So when you analyze the determinants, there are several types of factors that would affect a disease or health outcome. So predisposing factors are factors that influence the motivation to change, such as attitudes, values, beliefs, and knowledge. There are also enabling factors that facilitates or inhibits the behavior or environmental change, like societal factors or systems, resources, skills, income, and self-efficacy. And then reinforcing factors are those that provide feedback and further assist, hinder, or prohibit behavioral or environmental changes, like social isolation and support. In effective public health intervention, you will need to engage your stakeholders. Okay? It can include individuals, groups, or organizations. Stakeholders, by definition, okay, are those who have an interest in and or potential to influence the aims and actions of a program or policy. So when you think about a public health nutrition program, the most apparent stakeholders would be your target community, because they will have an interest in your program. But also there would be people like the relevant government agencies who may have the potential to influence your program, or your funder. Okay, these would be your stakeholders. Okay, and also you need to think about your adversaries. Okay, those who might try to hinder your program. depending on the type of program that you're running. So you need to identify potential alliances or conflicts. And it's important, stakeholder engagement is important to assist you to develop capacity building partnerships. So we mentioned many times, or we will be mentioning a lot of times, that in public health, it is important to build capacity, okay? Because the force, okay, the workforce in public health is so small, okay? There are only limited number of personnel running public health, especially public health nutrition. If you do not build capacity, you will soon be exhausted as the public health nutritionist. Okay? You can only be at so many places at a time. Okay, you can't be at 2 places at the same time. Okay, so if all of the programs that you run rely on you, then you can foresee some of these programs would fail when you're not around, because no one knows how to run the program. Therefore, it's very important to build components of capacity building in any public health nutrition interventions that you are going to run. And we'll talk to you, we'll tell you how to do it in the later lectures. So to analyze your stakeholders, you need to ask yourself these questions. Who does the problem affect the most? Okay, and then which subgroup is the most amenable to change? Who will be resistant to change or difficult to engage? Who could facilitate change? Who has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo? Who wants to see the problem addressed? What government or organizational jurisdictions should be involved? You need to identify who will be affected or concerned, and what is their interest and influence in developing solutions. So for example, for an obesity intervention, you can draw a stakeholder analysis plot like this. So on the x-axis, you have the influence, and y-axis, you have interest. A positive number in interest means that they are interested in. A negative number means they're very not interested in. Okay, so if you look at obesity, so parents, of course, this is a childhood obesity intervention stakeholder analysis. All right. So parents of obese kids would, of course, have very high interest because they want to see the problem, obesity in the kid, being addressed. But they have very little say about what could be done. So their influence is only rated as 1. Okay. Teachers, if they care about the health of the kid, should also have very high interest. And also, they will have slightly higher influence than parents. Scientists should have good interest and some better influence in the process. But if you look at those who have the biggest influence, such as food and drink industry, they have a more than average influence, but they have no interest. Okay. If you look at the president in the United States, he has 0 interest. Okay. Okay, this is not top on his agenda. Okay, but he has the best influence. Okay, so by doing a scatter plot like this, it can tell you who you should haggle, who you should advocate to. So in this case, Minister of Health, who has some influence and high interest. Okay, this will give you better success than haggling the president. Okay, the president will just refer you back to him or her. All right, so just go directly to the person who will give you the best return of your effort. Community participation. Okay, so community can also itself be a stakeholder, and community involvement in planning is very important for equity or rights point of view. Okay, or for pragmatic reasons, because as an outsider, you wouldn't have as good an understanding of the community as someone living in the community. Okay, so it will help you identify any barriers that prevents the target group from participating or engaging. So for example, as an outsider, you may want to go in a community to run a health promotion program at 2 p.m. Okay, on a Saturday morning or a Saturday afternoon. But by talking to the community, you will find out that most people in the community work in the catering industry, that they will need to work at 2 p.m. So no one will turn up in your wonderful program that you run on a Saturday 2 p.m. session because everyone is working. So without going into the community and talking to people, you wouldn't get this form of information easily. So by talking to those in the community, it helps you identify the barriers, okay, preventing the target group from participating. You can also get input from the proposed target group. So what do they think should be done regarding the issue? And you can help in the process create ownership of the program, because this is a program that they took part in creating. So it's somewhat their program, not just your program. Okay? You can do consultation, you can have representation on a steering committee of the program, you can run surveys. So to create community nutrition programs, you can use two different approaches. The first one is called the top-down approach, which in the technical term is called institution-led, which has very strong emphasis on expert knowledge. But this is often rejected by the community as being paternalistic. Versus another type, which is community-led, or we call it bottom-up approach, which involves community input. Sometimes in the society, both approaches are required, but you will be surprised to see how negative the views are on the first approach, the top-down approach in the community. Now, when we work in public health, it's very important for you to become aware of what we call the Ottawa Charter. Okay, so health promotion works through concrete and effective community action in setting priorities, making decisions, planning strategies, and implementing them to achieve better health is the priority in public health. At the heart of this process is the empowerment of communities, their ownership and control of their own endeavors and destinies. So that's the Ottawa Charter. Okay. You will find several items in the Ottawa Charter: strengthen community action, develop personal skills, or in other words, capacity building, create supportive environment, reorient health services, and then enable, mediate, and advocate. So these are things that are considered very important in public health. So to involve the community in public health, you can do different levels of involvement. You can just gather information from the community, which would have a one-way information flow, but you can get the involvement of the whole population by getting information of the whole population. And then consultation, which involves a two-way information flow. And then, of course, you can do it with the members of the affected communities. Collaboration, you can have participative decision-making by key stakeholders or key organizations. And then the best type to use is ownership, which involves shared decision-making or transfer of control. So it could be for clients, staff, managers, or decision makers. So community development versus community organizations. So community organizations involves health practitioners conducting needs assessment, involving the community in the planning, and then practitioners then facilitates the action. Whereas community development, or we call it community-based participatory research, involves working with the community to develop their skills or competence over time. That's what I said, you can only be at a number of places at a period of time. If you are absent, then you would want to make sure that someone can take over and run the program in your absence. So this is the way to do it. Okay. So there will be greater sharing of program management between the health practitioner and the community, and it's most appropriate for the vulnerable and socially disadvantaged groups, because as an outsider, you wouldn't have a better understanding of their actual needs than the person living in these vulnerable and socially disadvantaged communities. So the aim of community development is for communities to control decisions that affect them and gain control over the determinants of health. And in public health, there's what we call the Declaration of Alma Ata, which highlights the importance of community development or working with the community. People affected the most need to be involved in the process to ensure equity, and you will also want to seek to bring about changes to the whole community, not individuals. It is essential to change the structures that influence people's life, so environmental changes, okay, or create supportive environment as stated in the Ottawa Charter. Many current nutrition promotion or health promotion programs operate in communities that have health and social inequities, but these people are often the most powerless and experience other areas of greater needs. Therefore, you would need to build community empowerment to empower these people, okay, to make changes to improve their health. So empowerment is defined as access to and control over valued resources. So in a proper society, we would want to make sure that there is equitable distribution of resources and a fair spread of power. But unfortunately, in most developed societies, this is not happening. Okay? Resources are controlled in the hands of selected fews, a small proportion of the population. Now, how about community capacity building? It is an approach to the development of sustainable skills, organizational structures, resources, and commitment to health improvement in health and other sectors to prolong and multiply health gains many times over. So to build capacity, you can build infrastructure, which is required to deliver nutrition promotion programs such as health community centers, things like that. Build partnerships to improve program sustainability. So you can also gather more information or exchange knowledge between partners, and then build problem-solving capacity through skills and knowledge transfer. To build partnership, interdisciplinary partnerships are crucial. So when we work in public health nutrition, we don't just work with nutritionists or even just doctors. We work with people like social workers, we work with different NGOs, we work with government departments, we even work with universities. Okay, so you can do lots of different things with these different interdisciplinary partners. And then there's some resources that are available to the community for skill development, such as in the state, there is something called the Community Toolbox, which is a website containing online resources providing practical guidance on community building skills. That's developed by the University of Kansas. So it shows you that universities can also play a role in public health nutrition by generating things like these. In New South Wales, okay, in Australia, there is another website that provides an interactive clearinghouse for communities or those working with community to build solutions for these settings. Now, in New South Wales, again, there is the New South Wales Health Framework for Capacity Building. So it gives you a framework to work with when you try and run a community or public health nutrition program. So we want to ensure that within programs or even within the health system, you would build capacity in the infrastructure, program sustainability, and problem solving, as I've mentioned before. And overall, you would then get greater capacity of people, organizations, and communities to promote health. Program sustainability is crucial in the success of public health nutrition because money is limited. Okay, you might be able to get money, get a grant to run a pilot or run an intervention program for 2 years. What about after 2 years? Can you sustain the program after the funding dries up? Of course, you can apply for another round of funding, but there's no guarantee that you get it. So how do you make sure that your program, your wonderfully designed program that can improve the health of the community can be sustained in the long term? Of course, you would want to train and hire members of the community to run the program as champions. And importantly, there should be volunteers to keep the personnel costs down. Okay? So you want to bring in community stakeholders who also benefit from keeping the project going. Okay? You might need to search for other funding sources, so get recurring grants or get another grant and link your program with other existing programs. So to connect the program with the community and build community capacity to carry out the program. But there are some challenges with community participations. Okay? So most of the time, not most of the time, sometimes you find that the best practice intervention from literature may not actually be acceptable or feasible in your selected population. Okay? Therefore, you might need to select a less good intervention to work with your community or make changes to the intervention. There might also be conflicting views, interests, and priorities of your different stakeholders. So your final program may include a series of negotiated compromise rather than technically ideal solution. So there's no point sticking to the technically ideal solution when you understand that it's not acceptable or feasible in your target population. So it's never going to work because the reality tells you that this is not acceptable, not feasible in your target community. So public health nutrition requires lots of compromise, okay? Negotiated compromise. We don't always back down, okay, to the requests by the opponents, but sometimes compromises are necessary to get something done. Okay? Having something done is better than nothing done in public health, which is quite sad, but that's the sad truth. So by the end of the needs assessment, you should have an analysis of the determinants, that is the risk and contributing factors, behavioral, social, and environmental to your health issue. And also an analysis of the organizational context in which the program will be conducted, an indication of the resources needed, and commitment from a range of groups and parties to bring about change. So that are your potential partners, and also a rationale and focus of the program. Okay? So if you don't have any of these by the end of the needs assessment, then something is not right with your needs assessment. You might have missed some parts of the needs assessment. Okay? So I hope you now have a better understanding of needs assessment and the importance of it, and also how to conduct it.